We're now on the top of Daf Gimel Amid Beis. Vienna Osim Oso Ibur Bein Shtei Ayoros. And we're talking about the minimum shear of a bayit, which has to be 4 amos by 4 amos. And if it's less than that size, we had a whole list of dinim. It's excluded from a halacha of mezuzah, a requirement of mezuzah, a requirement of makeh. It's not matam b'negoyim. It's not nechlat b'batei arichoma. And now the last on the list is ein oseno so ibur ben shtei ayoros. And the point is that we have a halach of tchum Shabbos. You're not allowed to leave the outskirts of your city more than alpayim amma. So you shoves for Shabbos in a city. And the question is, what are the outskirts and the outer boundaries of the city? You have two cities that are near each other. Are they considered as one or as two? And if they're considered as two cities, then you can be in one city on this side and go alpayim amma beyond the outer bounds of the other city, because we do a chibur and we connect the two cities. Now, the question is, if there's a house in the space between one city and the other, that house could be a metzarif. It could link together the two cities, make it into one city. But once again, you're going to need a bias. Only a bias has the power to be metzarif. Now, what is the distance between these two cities that require a tziruf? Meaning, at what point do we say they're two separate cities because of the open space between them? And that's called mea ve'arbon ve'ach amos ve'ushlish, which, let's say you divide it in two, you've got 70 and 2/3 amma on this side, 70 and 2/3 amma on this side, for a total of 141 amos and a shlish. There's a house in between, exactly at that point, which is 70 and 2/3 here and 70 and 2/3 here. And at that point, you have a bias, and that could be mitzaref, but only if the bias is 4 amos in its size. Otherwise, if it's less than arba amra amos, it's not considered al pi din to be a bias, and it's not mitzaref to two cities. The eina achin v'ashutfim cholkim bo. The halacha is that if you have a partnership, or in the case of an estate, which is like a partnership that has to be divvied up, and when it comes to a bias, any of the members of this shutvis, or of the achim and the Yerusha, they have the right, each one, to force the other one to divide up a bias amongst them. But that's only in a case where you have a bias. If you don't have arba amos that fell to Yerusha to these achim, then it's not considered a shutvis or a Yerusha such that one ach or one of the shutfim could force the other shutf to divvy up the bias. Because after the chalukah, what are you going to be left with? You're going to get left with a small portion that doesn't have the dimensions of a bias. It's not even royal dira. Nobody can live there. So now the Gemara is going to focus our attention on the question of Sukkah that we discussed. We said that according to Rebbe, if a Sukkah is less than arba amos, it's not called a Sukkah. And it's not a base dira. According to Rabbanon, such a Sukkah, even if it's less than arba amos, is kshera. Should we say that all these dinim that we learned in this long brisa are against are like Rebbe to support Rebbe, and against the Rabbanon, when the Rabbanon say that you are chayiv in sukkah even though it's less than arba amos? Gemara rejects this. Afilu teim Rabbanon ad kan lo kami Rabbanon hasav el inyan sukkah de diras haroy havakami bias the diras kevahu afilu Rabbanon mode the islay arba direct. Lo dirabinj. The Gemara differentiates now between two concepts. One is a concept of a bias that serves and must serve as a diras keva, as opposed to a sukkah, which is not really a bias because the diras aroy. It's only a temporary dwelling place. Rabbanan might say that even something that does not qualify as a bias, i.e., it doesn't have the dimensions of arba amos, nevertheless, it still is considered a dira, and it's a place which, if it has even a very small area, nevertheless, it's a dira saroy. Imagine the case of a small sukkah that's 7 tfachim by 7 tfachim. It's enough for one person and fitting in a very tiny little table. But that's a dira saroy. We're not requiring a bias. So in sukkah, we never have a requirement of bias. The Torah never says b'beisechem teishu. It says b'sukkah teishu, and that's a diras saroy. Omar Mar, we go back to the Brisa. If you have a bias that's less than arba amos, then it's potem in a sukkah in a makeh, eno mitami b'negoyim, eno nechlat b'botei orichoma, eno chozonol b'orchei milchama. My time. Why is it that in all these dinim, if the area is smaller than arba amos, it's not included in this law? And the answer is the bias ksiv behu bekulo. In each one of these laws, you can see that the Torah requires a bias. For example, in mezuzah, uksavtem al mezuzah beisech v'yisharecha. And what is a bias? You could talk about a small bias, and that's fine, but it has to be at least a bias that has the area that's royal diras kema, and that's got to be arba amos. For example, the Torah says, with regard to Chozim Orchei Milchama, Ki Sivna Bayis Chodesh. And we have in the Parsha of Makeh, again, you built a bias. In the Parsha of Nigei Batim, the Torah says, Uba Asher Lo HaBayis. In Bati Arichoma, the Ishki Yimkar base Moshav Be'ir Choma. Etc. As far as Orchei HaMilcham is concerned, it says, V'dibru ha'shotrim el ha'am le'mar mi'a'ish asher bana bayis. Now that's all as far as Doraisas are concerned. Now we have a whole list of the Rabbanons, and they too require a bias of arbal arb. For example, ein ma'arvim bo, we're talking about eruv chatzeros. And if you have a very, very small house that's less than arba amos, it's not called a bias, and therefore it doesn't have to participate in eruv chatzeros, means to give a pass, a loaf of bread. Ein mishtakfe bo, if you have many chatzeros that share one central common mavui, then we need what's called a sheet of muvos. And if you require for the sheet of muvos, every one of the chatzeros that border on and spill into that mavo, you have to participate in the sheet of muvos. But what about a particular chatzer that a bias that opens up into it is very small? It's less than arbal arba. So if the only bias that opens up into this chatzer is a bias that's less than 4 amos, then that chutzah doesn't have to be part of the sheet of muvos. And the halacha is that we want to place the eruv down over Shabbos in the possession of one of the bnei chutzah, but not the person who owns this small bias, because he's not part of the chutzah. My timer, the lo chazi l'dira. Because if it's less than arbal arm, it's not royal udira. So the reason why the Chacham set up an eruv chatzeros or shita muvos is because they wanted to create a common rishus of every one of the dayarim as if they joined together. Because without this common rishus, the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to take from one rishus to another rishus. If there are different dayarim that live in each rishus, let's say you have a bias and you want to carry it to your base chavero, or from a bias to a chotzer. In all those cases, the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to do that. So if a bias belongs to a bailim and there's a chotzer which is a common courtyard for all the bnei chotzer that share in that area, then we require an erev chatzeros. However, if there's a chotzer, the bias of that chotzer doesn't have arba amos, and the rest of the bnei chotzer already set up an erev, this particular dayar who lives in this very, very small house did not participate in the erev. He did not offer a pas. And the halacha is that we don't need his pas. We can effectuate a valid eruv and consider all the batim and the chotzer that is common to all these batim as being part of the eruv chatzeros, to be matir tiltul throughout the area. And normally we say that if one bais refuses to participate in the eruv, he messes it up for all the other batim. But here he doesn't generate that isur, because if it's a bias that's less than arba amos, it's not called a dira, and he's not considered one of the dayarei achotze. He's a visitor. He's a guest, and therefore his rishus over that bias is not relevant. Same thing applies to shit of muvos. That if you have a bias in a chotzer, that chotzer is considered rishus, and it serves the dayarim of that bias, and we gather together all the different chatzeros and set up a sheet of muvos. And if some of the chatzeros if they refuse to participate in the sheet of muvos, then they generate an isar on all the other chatzeros. But if he doesn't have a bias, because all he has is something that's so tiny, it's less than arba amos by arba amos, then ein rishuso klum. In other words, that chotzer, his house is, right, his very small house opens into that chotzer, is not considered a chotzer that requires shituv muvos, because it's not considered a chotzer where there are dayarim in the bias, because there's no bias. So we need a bias haroy l'dira, and then the dayarim in the bias will be required to participate in the erev chatzeros and the shituv muvos. Normally we say in the absence of a participation of one of the bnei chotzer, that is going to torpedo the entire enterprise of shituv muvos and a ruvei chatzeros, but not in the case where this dayar lives in that which is ein haroy l'dira, and it's less than arba amos. Now, the Brisa says, ein manichin bo eruv. And now we want to clarify about shituv muvos. Eruvei chatzeros ein manichin bo. The implication is that Avol, however, with this bias katan, is lishtiv. We can do a shituv muvos. In other words, the Brisa was very careful in mentioning that the pas of the erev chatzeros cannot be deposited in the hands of this Baal Ha, we'll call it a dollhouse. Right? But since the Brisa mentions not a word about shituv muvos, the implication is that he could and should participate in the shituv muvos. So the Gemara asks, my timer. How can you put the pas of a sheet of muvos, or the food of a sheet of muvos, in the bias that's not a bias? And the Gemara answers, Dilogara michatzer shebamavu. That the situation or the status of this little teeny dollhouse is not any worse than that of a chatzah, the chatzah of a mavli. Reviewing the very last point that we said, a ma'arvim bo, a mishtatfim bo, a manichim bo eruv. We don't put the eruv in that bias that's so small, and the reason is delo chazi l'dira. Now, as far as Evuri v'chatzeros is concerned, although ein manichim bo in this bias katan, but manichim bo in the case of shitu muvos. And the last thing that we discussed was my time that even if we'll assume that since there is no ceiling on top of this, on this mavui, on the chatzah of the mavui, and therefore it still is considered a bias. Why? Because its walls are as if they don't exist. Nevertheless, it's a davar shehashituf omeid bi'aver b'chatzah. It's like the shituf is just hanging in midair. And if you can permit putting a shituf muvos in a chatzah and a mavui, the chatzah has no tikra, and therefore it's like air, then we can put it in this small bias as well. And the reason to justify the difference between erev chatzeres and shituf muvos is because erev hachatzer noad litziruf habatim. The purpose of the erev and the chotzer is to join together all the batim that share that one chotzer to make it considered as if it's one large bias, and therefore we have to leave the erev in a bias aroy l'dira. But shituf muvos is designated for the tziruf not of the batim that share a chotzer, but rather the chatzeros that share the mavui. The chatzeros are not a dira, and therefore you don't have to leave it in a dira. Just leave it in the avre l'chotzer. The snan, as we learned in a brisa, it says the snan, but it's a brisa. Leirue chatzeros. When you leave the pas that you collected for the erev chatzeros, we leave it b'chatzer. But as far as shituf mavo is concerned, we leave it in the mavu. But we ask, wait a minute, erev chatzeros b'chatzer. How can you possibly leave an erev chatzeros in a chatzer? That's the avir of a chatzer. We know that the erev chatzeros has to be has to be placed and deposited in a bias. And now we are calling a Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Erev and Pei Hey, and no saying a Ruvo. And now we have a list of places where the Erev is not valid because he put the pas in a Beishar, in an Achsadra, in a Merpeset. And let's go through these cases. We have number one, a Beishar. This is a small house, like a little budka, as we'd say today, in front of the shar, the gateway into the chatzir, or either on the inside or on the outside, and you go through this little beis shar in order to get into the chatzir. And usually that a security person, a shomer who would sit there, or if he put it in his erev in an achsadra, which is a place that has a ceiling without walls, and in a mirpeset, which is a case where you go up to the second floor of a building, a structure, and there are many different rooms on the second floor that open into a common mirpeset, a porch. And in each cheder, again, there are people who live in the cheder. They have an opening that takes them out into this porch. So there's this long porch in front of the psachim, the openings of this aliyah, of the various chadorim in the aliyah. And then what you do is everybody climbs a staircase in order to get to the second floor where the porch is. And through the porch, they go into the bias. Each one respectively is Eino Erev. Because Erev Chatzeros, we have to put in a base dira. And that's a dira in the Chatzer. And a base shar and Achsadjan and Mirpeset are not considered Re'uyim L'dira. They're just a place where you go through in order to get to the dira. And Vadarsham, if somebody lives in the Beis Shah, the Achsad, the Merpeset, and the other bottom of the Chutz made an Erev amongst them, and this fellow who's living in one of those three structures is not willing to participate in the Erev, Eino Oser, he doesn't undermine the validity of the Erev, because he's not considered as if he's Dar B'Chotzer. And we see that Bateim and the Chotzer is like one Rishus, and Nimtza Shebateim ve'HaChotzer, he Rishus Achas, Samyuchedes Rak Li'osam She'ervu, and the person who's living in the Beis Shar, he's not considered living in the Chotzer. Anyway, we see clearly from this Mishnah that Erev Chatzeres has to be left dafkin a bayis, a base dira. How therefore can the previous brisa allow you to put the Erev Chatzeros into a Chotzer? That's not a base dira. No one's living in the Chotzer. It doesn't have a ceiling. Ella Ema. Therefore, we have to reinterpret the intention of the brisa. Eruve Chatzeros bebayis shebechotzer. It doesn't mean that they should put it in the avir of the chutz, but rather they should leave the erev in the bias in the chutz. V'shita muvos has to be left b'chutz sheba mavui. It doesn't mean in the avir of the mavui. The Bryce is only coming to teach me that the erev is mitzarev, links together and integrates with bnei chutz, but only dafka shehunach bi oso chutz. If they place the erev in a different chutz, or in the case of shitu, which is mitzayif all the chatzeres the mavui, they have to be meiniach the shituv in that mavui, not in a different mavui. And therefore it says she'anichem bechatzer u b'mavui, meaning in that chatzer, in that mavui, but not in a different chatzer or in a different mavui. It doesn't mean that you can put in the avir of the chatzer of the mavui. You have to put in the bias of the chatzer and in the chatzer of the mavui. But in the case of a bias that ain't lo arbal arba, that's not worse than a chotzer in a mavui, which is not a base dira per se. And therefore, you're allowed to be meniach shitu muvos in the small bias, less than arbal arba. Then we had the brayse that we started here on Amid Beis, and also Ibur Bein Shtei Chatzeros. And the Gemara analyzes this and says, Afilu Burginin. Burginin is a small hut or a shack that is designated for the Shomrei Peiros, and they live in this small shack on the outskirts of the orchard or the fields, and they make this shack out of myrtle branches and reeds. And lomash vinale, we don't consider it as a chashva place. The burgenin are misarvim in a ear umitzarfin lo yet. If let's say you have a determination of what is the outside bounds, the ibra of the ear, then the burgenin can be mitzarev one city to another if it's situated in that area that we discussed. My timer. Why is it that our bais katan is worse than burgenin? The answer is because burgenin chazil milsayu, but hilo chazil milse. The burgenin was created, and it's suitable for those who are guarding the orchards and they sleep there overnight. But this bais katan is not roy for anything that you designated for, right? Because if it's a base dira and you're meant to use it as a dira's keva, this bias that doesn't even have 4 amos is not roy for a diras keva. Then we learned in the brayse that ein achiv v'shutvim cholkim bo, and time of the lesvei arba amos or isvei arba amos cholkim, which means that we can divide up an area. Let's say it's 5 amos by 5 amos, and one shuta for one of the yoshim can force the others to divvy it up. Even though after we split it, no one will have arba amos. And that's difficult for us. Now we have a Mishnah in Masechet Bava Basra Daf Yud Aleph. Ein cholkin es hachot arba amos lezeh v'arba amos lezeh. If you have, let's say, a common chotzer that's owned by two people, and one wants to force the other to divvy it up, he cannot do so unless after they divvy it up, you'll end up with arba amos for each one of the two bnei chotzer, which means that you need that the chotzer have the dimensions of 8 amos. And the Gemara thinks that logically that din of a bias is like the din of a chotzer. And a bias, we should not be able to divvy it up until it should have 8 amos, like the chotzer case in Bava Basra. And yet our brisa seems to imply that if the bias has more than 4 amos, we can split it, and we can force the shutfim and the yarshim to split it, even though after the chalukah no one will get 4 amos by 4 amos. And the Gemara answers that this brisa is not dealing with the chalukah of a bias amongst the brothers or the shutfim. Ela ema ein bo din chalukah bechotzer. The brisa has in mind that the brothers who inherit from their father this chotzer and the batim that open him up into the chotzer, that spill into this chotzer, should divide up the chotzer according to the batim in the chotzer in the following way. We're going to have 2 opinions about this. So a bias that doesn't have 4 amos is not considered a bias unto itself. And we're not miyachid a chotzer for that bias for the chalukas hayirusha. And the same thing is true in shutfim. So if somebody has a bias katan, which is less than arba amos, he doesn't get his chelik in the chotzer that this bias spills into. Yom Rav Yehuda, Yom Rav Huna, now we have machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Chizd exactly how to divvy up the chotzer in front of the batim. Rav Huna's opinion is chotzer lefnei psachera mischalekes. If you have a chotzer and there are many batim that open up into the chotzer, and the brothers are divvying up the batim that they inherited from their fathers, then says Rav Huna, one of these yarshim will receive 3. If one of the 3 yarshim receives 3 small batim, and the other brother, the other yarech, receives a very large bias, which counterbalances the 3 smaller batim, now they're divvying up the chotzer. Then Rav Huna says chotzer l'fi psacher mischalek, which means that one of the 2 brothers is going to get 3/4 of the chotzer because he has 3 batim, even though they're small, but it's l'fi psachim. Each one has its own pesach into the chotzer. So the one brother who owns a larger bias will only get 1/4 of the chotzer. The reason for this is because the chotzer is designated for Yitzia and Bia, that through the chotzer you either enter into the bias or from the bias you go out into Rosh Hashanah through the chotzer, and people will put their pekelach there in front of their openings, in front of the doors, and therefore we should divvy up the chotzer according to the Piskei Abatim. That's Rav Huna. Rav Chizda disagrees. Omar, and he's of the opinion that we don't divide up the chotzer based on the number of psachim, but rather no saying l'chol pesach u pesach arba amos. When we take the shetach, the area of the chotzer, we give each one of the psachim an area of 4 amos in front of his pesach. Keneged rochav pesach. And again, it doesn't matter how large the rochav of his pesach is. Each Baal Bayis will get keneged corresponding to the pesach of his particular bias, arba amos, al eser amos, and that's lefarik masos. He'll have plenty of room, adequate space to bring all his merchandise and have his deliveries, and so forth and so on. Vashar, the rest of the chotzer, after you've already divvied up for each pesach, arba amos, cholkin also b'shava. The remainder, the balance of the chotzer will be divided up equal. And on this din that we saw in the brisa, that the bais katan, if it doesn't have arba amos, and ein lepischa din chaluka litol b'chotzer klal, which means that there's no din of chaluk at all to get a separate section in the chotzer, and the pesach of the chotzer, pesach of the bais for the chotzer, because this bais doesn't have 4 amos on 4 amos. And now it seems to be against both Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. And the Gemara says, Hatam, the reason for this is Dahani Mili. When do we say that you get a chelik in the chutz, when you divvy up the chutz as a result of your Pesach into the chutz? Dahani Mili, that's only bias, when a bias, Dilamehevi Koi. In such a case, the bias is what's called Omed Lihiskayim, Lemehevi Koi. It's going to be there for long term. Is therefore, Yavina Le Chotzer. We give him a part of the chotzer, which he needs in order to put all his schayra there, Lefarik Maso. But high in this bias that doesn't have Arba Amos, the Lemistar Koi, it's not Omed Liskayim. We expect that we're going to completely demolish it so that we can make it royal Ladira. Lo Yavina Le Chotzer. We don't give the chotzer. Chotzer is only designated for the Pesach of a bias that's Omed Liskayim. Now, in our Mishnah, we learned that if the sukkah is above Esrim Amot Psula Ladas Chacham, now the Gemara wants to deal with this. How do you accept or implement the recommendation of the Mishnah that if the sukkah is above Esrim Amot, you have to be Mamayit, and you might think that Lamata, you just put pillows and bedding on the bottom of the floor, so it rises from the floor. So now it's the sukkah is less than Esrim Amma. No, the karmik sosos lo havi mute. That's not considered mute because he doesn't want to lose his karmik sosos, his pillows and his mattresses. He's not going to be mavatal them. That would be too much of a financial loss. He doesn't want it to become part of the karka of the sukkah, and if it's not mamayit, the height of the airspace of the sukkah. And here on Daf Dalid, the afal gav de lebatlinu lekulu. And this halacha that you cannot be mamayit the gova of an Esrim Amma sukkah by putting karmik susos, that applies even if he makes a declaration. He says, you know what? I am putting these karmik susos down long term for the 7 days of the Chag. I'm not going to take them away. No, that's Butler Daito Itzel Kolod. That's not the way, the derech, the accepted behavior pattern, that we take karmic sutzos that are expensive and we're going to mevatel them to the karka. That's going to mean suffer a great loss. And therefore his bittul is not a bittul, and his miyut is not a miyut. And we have to find a different method of being mamayit, the gova of the sukkah, so that it's less than Esrim Amma. And that in Mitzvah Shem, we will pick up on Yom Rishon. So let me take this opportunity to wish you a great Shabbos. Thank you very much.